Hello, History 17B Spring Quarter 2024. Remarkably, I do still actually exist. You have probably noticed that my approach to the progressive era so far has been light on presidents and political parties. This was, of course, deliberate because the focus on presidents often makes everything seem very top down. And the progressive era was far more about human dynamics than it was about presidential power. So now, when we look at presidents, let's just consider them one more part of the progressive puzzle rather than being the main driver. The massive alliteration with all the P's in the lecture title was actually accidental, but I would be lying if I said that it did not amuse me. So, lecture 14, the last piece of the progressive puzzle: political parties, presidents, and policies. Also, I know that the presidents are tiny here and hard to read, but I'm not going to ask you to name these or remember the order or anything with that. It starts to become more important as we transition closer to World War I, and I'll talk about those a little bit more. Over the period in section 1 here, federal chumminess with big business during U.S. continental expansion, Hayes to Cleveland's second term. As the title to the part suggests, government and business had quite a cozy relationship. We have seen this with the railroads west of the Mississippi, where the U.S. Army fought Native Americans off of their lands, and the federal government then gave a huge percentage of that land to major railroad owners, as well as basically financing the Transcontinental Railroad so that profits stayed in the hands of railroad owners. We've also seen this in the use of federal power in the suppression of labor movements, especially in the Homestead and Pullman strikes. The era saw 4 Republican presidencies and 2 Democratic ones. The Democratic ones were both Grover Cleveland, but regardless of the party, it didn't matter as much as it does later, as neither party ever had enough of a majority in Congress to have its way regularly. This first part is really the Gilded Age part of things. None of the presidential administrations did much to control businesses or the relationship of the US to an expanding global economy in any way. This is often referred to as laissez-faire economics, meaning a market with little or no government control or regulation. The wealthy class that we have seen made alliances with state and federal officials in order to protect the accumulation of massive profits. John D. Rockefeller Jr., whom we saw with the strikes of his miners in Colorado, married the daughter of Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was also the sister of Congressman Richard Aldrich. The Aldriches and their cohort in the Republican Party were known for their ties to business and fierce protection of business interests. In the cartoon on the slide, Nelson Aldrich is the one with the crown in the center. That would be John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s father-in-law. And the title of the cartoon is The Commercial Club of Washington, although it is supposed to be the U.S. Senate. For the period overseen by the Hayes to Cleveland Round 2 administrations, U.S. political parties functioned mainly by party loyalty. Voters typically made what are called standing decisions. Those are political choices, including votes, determined mainly based on family history and background rather than on specific issues. The 2 parties did have overarching positions, but standing decisions tended to assess the value of these by regional history rather than by current national policies. The objects on the slide are all election souvenirs from Grover Cleveland. So even though people made standing decisions, we'll see in a moment that they celebrated them. The Republicans in this particular time period, 1877 to 1897, and remember that the parties are going to change later in the 20th century. But in this time period, the Republicans backed commercial and industrial development with government support of railroads and corporations. And they favored high tariffs to protect domestic manufactured goods from foreign competition. The native-born in quotes here, white evangelical Protestants among the Republicans favored moral reform law, like prohibition. In response to Catholic schools in northeastern cities, they also sponsored laws to forbid state aid to Catholic church schools. The Democrats in our 1877 to 1897 period advocated for low tariffs and consumer prices. They opposed governmental aid to corporations, and they opposed most moral reform laws. The Democrats were generally split into two groups, which did not necessarily have much in common besides opposing the Republican Party. The first group was Irish and other Catholic immigrants to large cities, and they opposed laws barring Catholic schools, as well as being largely opposed to prohibition. And the other group was the Solid South. 16 southern states and the District of Columbia, which voted for the Democratic candidate in presidential elections from Reconstruction to World War I. This vote was based on the disenfranchisement of Black voters, as well as any Native Americans and Chinese in the South, although those populations were much lower. And they did this through poll taxes, literacy tests, and just outright threats and intimidation. Elections did not look like they do now. There were no printed ballots. Instead, there were brightly colored slips of paper filled out by hand and given to party organizers at the polls. The parties had big parades with bands and lots of campaign souvenirs like we saw. In my mind, it seems more like the festivities surrounding a major sports game now, with team loyalties based on habit more than anything else. Take note, however, that most of this only held for the eastern half of the US. Remember back when the North and South were hoping for Western states to side with them in culture and economy? Well, the Western states had their own issues, and neither the Democrats nor the Republicans of the era were particularly interested in the problems of Western farmers. The railroads basically set the rules for shipping goods, as well as creating grain monopolies that destroyed smaller farms and businesses through methods like pooling, rebates, and lower rates for long-distance transportation. And I've defined these on the slide. Pooling is agreements between railroads to set rates higher than they would be if there were market competition among different railroad lines. Rebates are money given back to shippers who used a particular railroad line exclusively. Basically, this ended up giving lower rates to large agricultural companies who formed an association with a particular railroad company, and lower rates for long-distance shipping. The large agricultural companies tended to supply the eastern US. Small farms and businesses generally distributed their goods more locally. Thus, they had to pay a higher rate than the big businesses. Eastern capital and non-resident investors meant that investments in Western and Midwestern buildings, slaughterhouses, breweries, railroads, telegraphs, and mines paid off for wealthy men in the Eastern US, as we saw with Rockefeller, siphoning away profits from folks west of the Mississippi. This linked to the development of deflationary spirals. And I have an image showing that on the slide, more or less the same as the wording that I've given you. A deflationary spiral is a debt deflation cycle that occurs when falling prices from a reduced money supply, keep that in the back of your mind, cause farmers and other producers to be unable to pay back loans from banks and other creditors. This results in bankruptcies and job loss, which in turn reduces purchasing power, which further reduces prices so that items will sell, which keeps the cycle going. Farmers did what everyone else in the progressive era was doing and formed organizations. In this case, these were cooperative organizations between smaller farmers that allowed them to combine their goods so that together they could act like a large company. Larger businesses tried to block these by calling the co-ops socialism, one of those scary European political economic ideas. Nonetheless, the cooperative organizations did hold up. The first of these to be well known was the National Grange of the Order of Patrons of Husbandry, usually just called the Grange. These challenged owners of railroads and grain elevators by pooling farmers' harvests and holding out for higher prices. They also pressured state legislatures to pass laws regulating railroads and grain elevators to keep prices fair. The Grange eventually morphed into the most outspoken advocate for farmers, the Farmers Alliance. This was local chapters which created cooperatives that sold grain and purchased supplies in bulk to save money for the members. They also formed small banks to ensure farmers' control over their money rather than financiers in the East. The Farmers Alliance and its local chapters saw to the particular concerns of different groups by forming those local chapters centered on one group, such as the Colored Farmers Alliance and the Women's Alliance. And these pressured the federal government, resulting in the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887, which created the first federal regulatory agency, the Interstate Commerce Commission. Heading back to the East, in this Gilded Age section of history here, and we're speeding through several in the intro to Module D here. During the Gilded Age section, both major political parties claimed to support industrial workers, but those workers saw what we have seen in earlier lectures, the federal government putting their weight behind owners in actions such as the Homestead and Pullman strikes. Samuel Gompers, head of the AFL, American Federation of Labor, said that he would only back one party over the other and then encourage his union members to do so if one of the parties would pledge that government, including the courts, would not interfere with unions' efforts to organize workers. Neither party agreed, so unions did not back either party. At the national level, this didn't make a real difference yet, but the mayoral election info in 1886, New York City, showed interesting potential for a hot minute. One Henry George, here on the left, a journalist who wrote a book calling for a single tax, ran for mayor. Basically, the single tax was a heavy tax on land ownership, and it was actually popular with workers across the world, including China, Australia, and Ireland. George ran for mayor under what was called the United Labour Party. In addition to industrial workers, George earned the support of the Farmers Alliance where it crossed over into the East, and he also won the support of the liberal wing of the WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union. Remember, women couldn't vote, but they did lobby for the WCTU, and men could also be members of the WCTU, even though it's women's. Business Republicans and urban Democrats who benefited from the two-party system joined forces to find a candidate to defeat George. And they managed to win, but by a very narrow margin. And I've noticed that these don't, I think that the numbers have been flipped here for United Labor and Democratic. The distant third place finisher in that mayoral election was Theodore Roosevelt, whom we shall see again in a bit. Focusing on the Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland back and forth in the latter half of this Section 1 period, we start to see the two main political parties trying to figure out how to please enough different groups to win the votes for presidency. Before we go on with that, however, let's take a quick look at the way that US money worked at the end of the 19th century. The gold standard is a monetary system in which a country's money, coins and paper bills, is linked and valued directly to the value of gold, and the country's government sets a fixed price for gold. In somewhat more straightforward terms, the gold standard meant that you could take your money to the government and they would be able to produce a chunk of gold of equivalent value. Backing money with gold means that the country actually has to have the gold if called upon. So at the time, the US stockpiled gold at Fort Knox, and it still does have some there. This also shows where other gold now is stored, even though we are not on the gold standard. But you see Fort Knox still has a sizable chunk of gold. In Grover Cleveland's first term, Republicans in the Northeast, remember, based in industrial production, were alarmed by the fact that Cleveland, as president, kept pushing to lower tariffs as an almost single-minded cause. These Northeastern industrialists rallied to make certain that Cleveland was defeated in the election of 1888, replacing him with former Civil War General Benjamin Harrison, although Cleveland did win the popular vote. But under Harrison, the Republicans went all in on the agenda of Protestant piety, which tended to alienate most Americans. Republicans took the hint and decided to focus on economic issues rather than cultural control in 1890. Republicans got what was called the Tariff of 1890 through Congress. In 1890, you'll be shocked to hear. It is also called the McKinley Tariff for the congressman who backed it. The tariff was basically high tariffs on imported goods. Importers also had to send gold to the US Treasury to pay fees. So the tariff meant a reduction in competition from cheap imported goods, which pleased some farmers, along with those who relied on industrial production for their living. But the tariff of 1890 also required importers, the importers, to send gold to the US Treasury to pay importation fees. This is where we get to the gold standard bit. When lenders called in loans from Western farmers so they could pay importation fees, they often wanted solid coin to be certain of the payment. No computer transfers or just trust in money. And with the tariff, that coin was becoming scarce. The Republicans tried three somewhat ham-handed and very insincere efforts to win over parts of the American electorate besides business owners. The first of these was the Dependent and Disability Pension Act, which authorized pensions for disabled veterans and widows of Union soldiers from the Civil War. They hadn't had pensions before. That was a good idea, but by 1900, 40% of the federal budget went to pensions. Combined with the tariff, this proved extremely pricey for middle-class consumers. The combined tariff pension strategy backfired by resulting in increasing prices for consumers, many of whom were in that white middle-class voting bloc. Republicans tried to get anti-big business credibility. Notice not actually go after big business, but get the credibility for it with the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. And you will often hear this as an, oh, this was great. It really broke up trust. Well, ostensibly, it broke up monopolies, but it was weak when it came to enforcement and vague in wording. The first cases brought to court went in favor of the monopolies. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was more of a gesture than an actual change. And finally, of the three, the Republicans scotch taped on one more attempt to get voter support with the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. This required the federal government to purchase extraordinary amounts of silver from Western mines and issue bonds, which could then be paid back with the bondholder's choice of gold or silver. Most silver miners chose the more valuable gold, further reducing available supplies. Folks who owned silver mines in Nevada, Colorado, and Montana loved this. Everyone else, not so much. The result of the lack of response to many Americans' actual situations was one of the more successful third parties of the 20th century, the People's or Populist Party, formed by a coalition of the Grange, Farmers Alliance, Union Labor Party, and other smaller groups who felt rather justifiably that neither major party actually listened to them and paid attention to their on-the-ground needs. Representatives of the Populist Party met in Omaha, Nebraska in July of 1892. A platform is the set of issues that a political party metaphorically stands on. So each issue is referred to as a plank in the platform. Since the Populists met in Omaha, their set of favored reforms was called the Omaha Platform. You can read the text of the actual platform as a primary source on Yacht, but leaving out some things like support for military pensions, it boiled down to what I have on the slide here: a graduated income tax by which the wealthy would pay more for the care and upkeep of the nation than the poor. That was not a thing yet. Direct election of senators by voters rather than by state legislatures. Secret ballots. Public ownership, meaning run by the federal government, of necessary services like railroads, telegraph, and the postal service. A mandatory 8-hour workday. What they called free silver, which meant basing currency on both gold and silver, making for more currency in circulation. The Omaha Platform, the Populist Party, also was big on immigration restrictions. Although women did not yet have the national vote, many women campaigned visibly for the Populist Party, offending the sensibilities or raising the fear of change, depending on how you view it, of moral conservatives. Conserve means to keep unchanged, and things were changing. For a third party, the Populist Party actually did okay in the 1892 elections. They got 11 seats in the US Congress. They got a few governorships. They got majorities in state legislatures of Kansas, Nebraska, and North Carolina. And finally, they also managed 22 electoral votes for president. Cleveland won the election of 1892, his second term, but not consecutive. Then came 1893, and you've heard about the Panic of 1893. I am not exactly crying for Cleveland here, but this was a disaster to his second presidency. Some of the consequences of the Panic of 1893 you've already heard about, but to summarize them and the other consequences here, the Panic of 1893 resulted in the failure of smaller railroads, banks, and businesses, and that was accompanied by massive unemployment. In response to that, starting in 1894, armies of unemployed workers They called themselves somebody's army. So Coxey's army, you may see in Yob, and it's one of those. They marched on Washington, D.C., demanding that the federal government alleviate unemployment with public works projects and federal jobs. These were peaceful, but there was also major labor unrest. And one of the other problems with the Panic of 1893 is it was a rush of bondholders who wanted to redeem their notes for gold. So they're worried that US bonds aren't going to be worth anything. They all want that limited supply of gold at once, and it can't happen. Banks don't have it. Cleveland turned to big business for solutions, including turning to financier JP Morgan for the immediate loan of gold to the federal government with the promise of repayment in the form of federal bonds with 4% interest. The optics of this were not great. First, it showed how very wealthy and powerful folks like Morgan had become at everyone else's expense. Morgan basically used his vast fortune to increase his vast fortune at the expense of everyone else. It made it screamingly clear how much power folks like Morgan exercised over the government. And you can see that in this cartoon here. And it says, merely recognizing a fact. And JP Morgan, centralized wealth, holds the control of everything, even if what people see is supposedly Congress. So at Wall Street, natural resources, transportation, public utilities, business, credit, he's got control of it all. And he is not an elected official. When it came to the election of 1896, Democrats dropped Cleveland like a hot potato. Democrats rejected pro-business policies in that election and created a watered-down version of the populist platform. They nominated William Jennings Bryan, who called for unlimited silver coinage. And you can find, you'll hear about his famous Cross of Gold speech. You can find it in Yop as part of the primary sources. Yop also has an entire section on William Jennings Bryan, so you can read about him there. I'm not going to go on and on about the man himself. That's the Democrats. We've already seen the Republicans scrambling to figure out which voting bloc they should try to collect. Miners, pensioners. Republicans nominated William McKinley, who was backed by wealthy businessmen. Remember the McKinley Tariff of 1890? McKinley got support from the part of the middle class that left the Democratic Party because they figured that Bryan's monetary policy would result in massive inflation. Bryan lost the Eastern working class for the same reason. Additionally, Bryan read as thoroughly evangelical, which made Catholic and Jewish Americans uneasy. As you see, McKinley won. And that takes us to the next part of this lecture. One more thing before I go on, though. I didn't note before, but the things that are in beige are territories. They're not states yet. And you notice that this is turning into Oklahoma territory, and Indian territory is being squeezed even more. McKinley was elected to 2 terms, but was assassinated before he could fulfill his second term. I will be coming back to that, but I want to address events in McKinley's full term on their own first. This is largely because during McKinley's first term, the U.S. moved on from colonizing North America. They'd reduced Indian country, Indian territory to less than Oklahoma. The U.S. moved on from colonizing North America to overseas imperial conquest. And this is a big switch, and that's why this lecture is in the lead up to World War I module. McKinley was lucky to have a fairly good economy during his first term, and consolidation of the continental U.S. was largely completed, except for the little bit of Indian territory there. On the other hand, even before McKinley's term, The U.S. production in both farm and industry started outgrowing demand of the U.S. alone. So they couldn't sell as many goods in the U.S. as they were producing. While the U.S. was busy displacing Native Americans and forcibly colonizing the center of North America, white Americans actually distanced themselves from European imperialism. Oh no, we don't do that. If you dig into this logically, it does not make much sense. But if you view it as a growing idea of Americans' exceptionalism, we're not like anyone else. We have a frontier. We're not colonizers. If you take that exceptionalism as a basis for nationalism, which it was becoming, then the contradiction works. Generally speaking, before the late 1890s, the US avoided full political takeover outside of North America, but they had no problem with vigorously pursuing foreign markets, whether they were welcome or not. When it came to supposedly civilized, meaning, as we have seen, with lots of money to invest, European nations, American entrepreneurs borrowed heavily from British banks. Keep that in your mind. American entrepreneurs borrowed heavily from British banks, while wealthy Europeans invested in the industries and railroads of the US. Justified with civilization discourse, U.S. businesses pursued markets, resources, and ventures in less wealthy nations, while American missionaries and moral reformers spread over most of the non-European world, seeking converts to Christianity and meek acceptance of supposedly superior Euro-American culture. Wealthy US tourists spent money abroad, but at the same time, sometimes, often, treated people not from the US and Europe as at best curiosities and at worst as not fully human. The cartoon here of the octopus with its tentacles grabbing everything is for Standard Oil, but the United Fruit Company was also nicknamed El Pulpo, forgive my pronunciation, or the octopus. By 1872, one of the US super wealthy men started building a railroad in Costa Rica and planting bananas to the sides. In 1884, the same man, Minor C. Keith, whom we don't often think of with Carnegie, Rockefeller, and JP Morgan, but we probably should. At any rate, in 1884, Keith contracted with the government of Costa Rica to fund the national debt of Costa Rica and to lay another 50 miles of track. In return, Keith got an amazing deal. It's nice if you can pay the national debt of a small country. Keith got full rights to his rail lines for 99 years and was given 800,000 acres of undeveloped land in Costa Rica that would be exempt from taxes for 20 years. The United Fruit Company was formed by a merger of Miners banana plantations along with another company in 1899. The resulting large company was based in Boston, but extracted resources from Central America. I am going to make a very complicated story short here and cut to the big point. United Fruit kept expanding until it was the largest employer in Central America. United Fruit used its power to coerce Caribbean, Central, and South American governments to sign over huge tracts of land that the company cleared to build plantations. United Fruit also controlled railroad transport in Central America and a fleet of ships called the Great White Fleet. I do not make this stuff up. As you can see on the map on the slide, the reach of United Fruit was a bit like an octopus with tentacles infiltrating everywhere. That is an example of the US interfering to the south. The US also reached west to Asian markets. This is the state of the Pacific world in 1897. The Philippines here were in the process of declaring independence from Spain, who had been holding the islands as a colony in its empire since the Renaissance. Midway Island up here has been claimed by the US. At this point, Hawaii was recognized by the US as an independent nation, but not one ruled by Hawaiians, whose government was overthrown in 1893, but by American sugar planters. I'm not going to dig into Hawaii deeply, but I will point out, because it matters, that although at this point the US did not annex Hawaii, American sugar growers had essentially taken over, a little like the banana plantations, except here the owners actually lived on their plantations. Remember that Republicans had pushed through a high tariff on imported goods. The sugar planters wanted Hawaii annexed by the US so that their sugar transported to the US would count as domestic with no tariff rather than foreign. If we look down here in the bottom right corner, we can just see the label for Samoa, and it's only one square there, but Samoa is actually a group of 14 volcanic islands. Their main appeal to imperial nations is their location. They're a bit of a stepping stone from either Europe or the US on the way to Asian markets. At the time, ships burned coal, and both Germany and the US wanted Samoa as a coaling station. Both countries sent fleets, and Germany and the US were actually on the brink of war when a typhoon scuttled the fleets of both nations. I kid you not. At the Berlin Conference of 1889, so actually before McKinley's presidency, Britain, Germany, and the US split Samoa into a tripartite protectorate, a bit like being protected by a mob boss, which is what you see in this cartoon. It says a tug of peace, and it has Samoa being pulled in different ways by the British, the Americans, and the Germans. In 1899, so now we really are to McKinley, Britain gave over their part of Samoa, and Germany and the US divided the islands between just the two of them. A big issue to the US was having a navy that could keep up with everyone else. Great Britain had the biggest navy at the time. Germany had a sizable navy. Japan's navy was growing large enough to challenge Russia. The US government and corporations felt that unless they had a navy that could hold its own against these, the US might lose access to those markets in Asia, all over here, into which excess agricultural and industrial products could be exported. The US had it all planned out. They would need a large merchant marine to carry goods, in case you've ever wondered what the merchant marines do. And the US would also need long-range steel battleships to protect the merchant marine ships. The desired huge force would need a network of colonies to be used for coaling, making repairs, and obtaining raw materials. And the US would also need a canal bisecting Central America, connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific, because up to now, ships have had to sail all the way around South America if they were coming from the Atlantic. The 19th century arms race was on. The US, British, German, and Japanese fleets grew, but the Spanish, who had claimed a gigantic empire in the 1600s, was gradually seeing that empire fall apart in the 1800s. Part of that crumbling empire was Cuba in the Caribbean, rather close to the US, just off the coast of Florida here. We have been looking at the reach of American commercial interests spreading outside of the US well before American military forces. US capitalists invested heavily in Cuba's sugar, mining, and tobacco industries. Big U.S. corporations also convinced Cuban planters, so not the laborers, but the plantation owners, to sign over their lands for stock or jobs in the big U.S. firms. But also remember that there were tariffs in the U.S. to discourage competition of foreign goods with U.S. products. As in Hawaii, the firms making money were American, but the products, like sugar, were grown in a foreign country, here Cuba, and had to pay the tariffs. We also know that American corporate owners did not like giving up any money if they could possibly help it. The map you are looking at is the extent of the Spanish Empire at its height. So this is way back in the 1600s here. You know that by our Module C timeframe, the US had this bit here. Mexico had become independent. Sorry, I went over Mexico there. And Central and South America also saw revolutions that overthrew Spanish rule and established independent nations. Spain still had some islands, notably Cuba, that we've talked about, and the Philippines over here in the Pacific. You may remember that a few slides ago when I showed the Pacific, I said that the Philippines were in the process of throwing off Spanish rule. Well, so was Cuba. Spain was absolutely brutal in both the Philippines and in Cuba. This was the era of yellow or sensationalist journalism in the US. And people literally starving right next to the US and Cuba made good copy with pictures like this one, and it sold papers in the US. This began, as far as the US was concerned, while Cleveland was president. Spain had been down there well before. We saw that. US opinion overall was a completely mixed bag on the issue of Cuba. There were those who were genuinely moved and thought that the US should help the Cuban people. And there were those who saw a great opportunity for the US to expand its manifest destiny wings. Under Cleveland, U.S. policymakers feared that a war with Spain would jeopardize American commercial interests in Cuba. And these policymakers did not consider the Cuban people to be, in quotes, advanced enough to govern their own country. In order to avoid official U.S. entanglement, Cleveland, as president, declared neutrality. Initially, McKinley also went with official neutrality, but when an uptick in resistance and violence threatened U.S. citizens and investments in Cuba, McKinley sent the battleship, you see it here, the USS Maine, to Havana Harbor to be ready to defend American interests if necessary, or at least to loom over everyone as a threat not to mess with Americans. On 15 February 1898, the Maine exploded. Recent studies have attributed the explosion to coal dust that ignited in the enclosed space of the ship. But the explosion was a goldmine for Americans who wanted to go to war already, either to annex Cuba or to prove the masculine power of the US. And yes, it was expressed in those gendered terms. Chief among those calling for war was Theodore Roosevelt, the guy who lost the mayor's race for New York City, but would become the city's police commissioner and a governor of New York State, where we saw him when we discussed tenement reform in the last lecture. T. Roosevelt explicitly linked a particular notion of masculinity to American nationalism. One aphorism from him carved into the rotunda of the Natural History Museum in New York City reads, this is a quote, all daring and courage, all iron endurance of misfortune make for a finer, nobler type of manhood. Earlier in his career, with regard to a U.S. dispute with Great Britain, who had the greatest navy, right? Roosevelt said, I don't care whether our seacoast cities are bombarded or not. We would take Canada. Personally, I rather hope the fight will come soon. The clamor of the peace faction has convinced me that this country needs a war. Just any old war, I guess, where people get killed. When it came to the remnants of the Spanish fleet and empire, Roosevelt said, "It is very difficult for me not to wish a war with Spain, for such a war would result at once in getting a proper navy." He also told the commander of the American fleet near the Philippines to be ready to fight the Spanish fleet there a couple of months before the explosion of the Maine. Finally, when McKinley sought to avert war and was in discussions with Spain, T. Roosevelt publicly commented, "McKinley has not more backbone than a chocolate eclair." There was a great deal of anti-war and anti-imperialist sentiment in the US, but Roosevelt had a powerful ally in wanting war and empire. When I introduced yellow journalism, I said that we would come back to the most famous example, and here we are. The New York Journal, "Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. Assistant Secretary Roosevelt convinced the explosion of the warship was not an accident." Blazing headlines. Hearst quite deliberately sold the story that Spain had sunk the American battleship Maine, although this made absolutely no sense as an action for Spain, and most investigations, even at the time, suggested that whatever the cause, it was highly unlikely to have been a deliberate attack. Hearst bragged. Newspapers form and express public opinion. They suggest and control legislation. They declare wars. They punish criminals, especially the powerful. The newspapers control the nation. And once war was declared, Hearst asked his readers, "How do you like the Journal's War?" It's not called the Journal's War, though. It's called the Spanish-American War. T. Roosevelt and Hearst got their way. The one concession that the anti-war and anti-imperialism contingent got was the Teller Amendment, stating that the United States did not intend to annex Cuba, and even getting that was a difficult fight. For his part, once war was inevitable, T. Roosevelt, who had been in the Navy Department, withdrew from it, ordered a blue lieutenant colonel's uniform from Brooks Brothers, and assumed deputy command of the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, which he named the Rough Riders. The regiment's commander was T. Roosevelt's close friend, Colonel Leonard Wood, a former frontier military surgeon and Indian fighter. I have given you the chapter from Dunbar Ortiz's book because I want you to connect U.S. imperialism on the North American continent with the deliberate projection of American power overseas. Americans as a whole were deeply divided when it came to what was so obviously imperialism at this point. T. Roosevelt, however, was all about image, both for himself and for the nation, and pretty much the same image for both of a very narrow take on aggressive masculinity. And you can see his reference to white American cowboys and Indian frontier mythology in the image that he deliberately projected. T. Roosevelt made certain that he had newspaper reporters, along with his campaign in Cuba, to write stories for popular American audiences on the heroism of his Rough Riders, which the journalists dutifully did. In fact, T. Roosevelt and the Rough Riders tend to get almost sole credit in popular history for winning the Battle of San Juan or Kettle Hill. You might be forgiven for not realizing that there were other troops there, including the 24th and 25th Infantry and the 9th and 10th Cavalry, all 4 of which were Black units, often called Buffalo Soldiers. You notice that they are missing from the photo op. in the immediate aftermath of the battle, Teddy Roosevelt raved about their bravery. But once he got back to the US and started honing his political image with aspirations for the presidency, he said, quote, Negro troops were shirkers in their duties and would only go so far as they were led by white officers. One of the members of the 10th Cavalry responded, his, meaning Roosevelt's, statement was uncalled for and uncharitable. And considering the moral and physical effect the advance of the 10th Cavalry had in weakening the forces opposed to the colonel's regiment, both at Las Guasimas and at San Juan Hill, altogether ungrateful, and has done us an immeasurable lot of harm. T. Roosevelt went to Harvard. He was the son of an extremely wealthy family. His, quote, strenuous light image was very carefully crafted. As one professor at Harvard in the early 20th century noted, the Spanish-American War promoted T. Roosevelt from a colonelcy to the presidency. We will pick up that story in part 2 of this lecture. But before we leave part 1 here, let's take a look at America's new overseas empire. At the end of the Spanish-American War, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam became U.S. dependencies. Congress's war resolution had renounced U.S. claims to Cuba, but the island remained under U.S. military rule for more than 3 years, and the U.S. Navy retained a large base at Guantanamo, which it still holds now. Expansionist zeal had led Congress to annex Hawaii in July, and in 1899, the United States and Germany would divide the archipelago of Samoa. America was now a major stakeholder in the Far East. The US was not quite a world power yet, but it was definitely maneuvering to become one.